Dr. Patti Peeples, and welcome to the next episode of Patti's People, sponsored by the Evidence Base. Today, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Jason Shafrin, Senior Managing Director for the Center for Health Economics and Policy at FTI Consulting. Prior to joining FTI, Jason served as the Vice President at Precision HEOR, and he has previously also served as the Policy Lead at Acumen, where Dr. Shafrin helped the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services implement value-based purchasing programs for physicians, hospitals, and home health agencies. Jason has also served as the Director of Research and as a scientific advisor to the Innovation and Value Initiative, or you might know it as IVI, which is an NGO or a nonprofit dedicated to making value assessments more patient-centered. Welcome, Jason. I'm really happy to have you here today.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Well, let's get started. I'm always curious for our peers that have had long and illustrious careers, and I know you're in the midpoint of yours. But you, in this time that you've been in the workforce, you've worked across a variety of different types of institutions, from government, pharma, consulting, NGOs, and academia. What is the central thread that pulls through each of these, and what is the big idea that sort of drives you as you navigate these next stages?
Yeah, I mean, I think the goal is really to improve decision making. We want to improve patient outcomes as much as we can at a reasonable price, and doing that involves trade-offs. Do we try to get a little bit more on the outcome side and maybe higher price? Do we try to be a bit more conservative on the pricing side? How do those things trade off? How does that vary by disease, patient preferences, etc.? And I think what I bring is the quantitative economist point of view. Certainly that's not the only point of view that's needed, but that's helpful to supplement a lot of the different areas. So how do we make those trade-offs and make those trade-offs really explicit? If you think about potential value-based pricing for physicians, we want to incentivize higher quality, more efficient care. If we think about value-based payment for pharmaceuticals, we want to incentivize high quality, innovative pharmaceuticals at a reasonable price. And so really kind of improving the decision making, putting the incentives in place for the best potential outcomes for patients and society. There are a lot of different perspectives depending on if you're government or life sciences or academia or payers or provider health systems, but really the ultimate goal, I think, is pretty similar across all those different stakeholders.
Well, was it the quantitative side of things, or was there something about the mashup of the ethical and the social and the clinical challenges? What's the spark that made you say, look, this is the segment of health economics that I want to devote my career to?
Yeah, I mean, I think going back, I went to grad school for an economics program, and the solution to a lot of problems in different industries is, we need more free market, less regulation. And how do we get to that? Maybe we can deal with some market failures. And I think in healthcare, it's a lot more complicated. We don't have perfect competition. We have issues of moral hazard, that people aren't really paying for the healthcare themselves. It's through insurance. You have the consumer themselves aren't making all the decisions, right? I don't know which drug is best for me or what surgery. I rely a lot on the physicians to weigh in versus I can pick whatever. I'm pretty informed of which iPhone I pick or which car. I can kind of do that research. It's a lot harder for me to figure out, do I do a surgery? Do I take a drug? Do I not do treatment? So you have a lot more influence there. And then, for most markets, if people want to get a Ferrari, if they can't afford it, I don't really feel bad for them, or, but for healthcare, certainly we're not letting people who are sick just, hey, fend up for yourself. And if you can't do that. So So that makes it a lot more complicated. That doesn't mean the solution is, we have to do 100% government, or it doesn't mean the solution should be, 99% free market, but there are these trade-offs that are there. And so because of that, I got really interested in health economics because, you don't have a super obvious solution. There's always this tension between addressing those challenges to get to a desirable outcome.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Tension is a good way to put it. So you've written extensively on value frameworks, and that's part of your remit with IVI. And you've been deeply involved in developing these value-based outcomes for reimbursement. If you could wipe the slate clean and you were to design and redesign HTA from the ground up, what would you toss and what would you keep?
Yeah, I think just wrote the generalized cost effectiveness analysis that was published the end of last year, and I think that would be kind of a good place to start. I think what are we trying to accomplish with HTA, and the goal really is we want to incentivize new medical technologies so that the benefits to society outweigh the costs. That's just really the kind of the whole purpose. And to do that, we should look at like all the societal costs and all the societal benefits and kind of weigh those. And that's, I think, kind of the purpose of HTA, kind of aligning those. Usually in a general approach, markets kind of solve that problem, but because, for pharmaceuticals, those are monopolies. Those that, aren't necessarily in pure markets. Obviously you can have competition that can change prices over time. But so you need kind of an external evaluation. So we want to set those things up. How do we set them up? What are we trying to do with the prices? And really let's think about all the benefits and cost of society. So it's pretty simple, I think, on the face of it. And I think being more inclusive of all the costs and benefits certainly would be a really good step in the right direction.
At one point, do you say that the juice isn't worth the squeeze on that?
Yeah, I think there's kind of there's a feasibility and there's a magnitude issue. So if you say like, we're talking about caregiver burden, and you think, okay, for patients with very mild diabetes, okay, you can add that in. It's probably going to be fairly small, but you can add that in. If you say, Alzheimer's, we don't care about the caregivers. That's like a huge miss there. And I think if you think about products that have, been on the market a long time and do we incorporate uncertainty? Like, yeah, you can, but that's not make a huge difference. If you think about, kind of more experimental products and that have, the gene therapies that could work fantastic, but are they going to last for 20 years? Well, there's a lot more uncertainty there. Should we incorporate that? So I think there's kind of, here is the philosophical thing we should do, include all the costs and all the benefits. But then when you actually do the implementation, there has to be kind of an a priori, is this going to make a big difference? If so, great, let's look at it. If it's going to be pretty small, again, it's fine to estimate, but it shouldn't be mandated. If you just say this is small, and then just how feasible is it to estimate? It could be just a challenge to do, but again, that's kind of a functional kind of limitation rather than philosophically we're still trying to do that. And can you make approximations or
So what I'm hearing you that if you were to redesign HTA from the ground up, that some sort of universal model would not fly with you, that there would be flexibility.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's kind of a general framework, and then but that has to be adaptable, for specific diseases as well. So come from the same philosophical point of view, but then the implementation needs to be more flexible.
So some of your work at CMS was looking at the value-based purchasing programs for a variety of different stakeholders. And you've also noted that incentives drive behavior. Certainly, most economists agree with that. And we have competing incentives to beat the band, so to speak, in the medical area and healthcare. If we set out to fix this whole incentive action issue, where should we focus? What, in your opinion, are the most misaligned incentives in today's healthcare ecosystem, and who is it hurting the most?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly like a lot of specific, different types of incentives where things are in conflict. But I think at a really high level, the biggest issue is thinking about kind of short-term versus long-term thinking. If you think about pharmaceuticals, the best way to have the highest, benefit to society is you just waive all the patents. And once the drugs are developed, that's super cheap. They exist. That's great. But obviously long-term, that's highly problematic. No one's going to develop any drugs. So there's always some incentive to do that. If you think about, okay, there's public health emergencies. Should we just waive patents like during that time? But then who's going to develop, innovative treatments for public health emergencies? If you think about compounding pharmacies for GLP-1s, they stepped in when there was a supply shortage, which is great. But, when the supply kind of came back, are they still kind of able to skirt some of the market exclusivities? I think if you also think about, for patients, a lot of the medicines that work really well, if you think about kind of cardiovascular drugs, in the short run, they really have like no impact on your health. You don't feel any different. Like, if I feel better today versus tomorrow, no. But, years from now, you're going to have less heart attacks, things like that. And so having the long-term thinking, I think certainly for Medicare, you can think about it as well, that you have a pay-as-you-go system. So you're just thinking about payments now versus like, is the system sustainable? So I think there are a lot of different stakeholders and kind of their incentives, being a lot aligned. But I think in terms of the overall healthcare system, the short-term versus long-term thinking, and certainly, thinking about what's the benefits overall in the long term is extremely important. But there is such a I would say is, opportunity or people say like, well, let's just look at the short run. But that certainly can have negative impact for long run overall benefit.
So, Jason, let's dig a little deeper on incentives, and to make the evaluation a little easier, let's focus on type 1 diabetes. There are numerous stakeholders where there may be misalignment between their benefits, risks, and cost. How would you change the incentives in this diabetes arena to be more appropriate?
Yeah, I mean, I think one good kind of example of some of the tension between different stakeholders is the pharmacy benefit managers. There's certainly like their incentives are, I think most lay people think it's to, lower drug prices, but really they want to maximize rebates. And to do that, the best way to do that is, have higher list prices and, larger rebates. And so I think that's a challenge. For the pharmaceutical companies, it's problematic because, you don't have any incentive to lower the prices. You're just giving the larger rebates.
Mm-hmm.
I think for the payers, they also, if don't, would, see the rebates, and they don't kind of know what the counterfactual would be, if there weren't these large rebates. And so I think you see that there's kind of a lack of transparency there. I think the PBMs would say, okay, well, without us, kind of the net prices would be higher. So certainly the list prices are higher because of us, but we have bigger rebates. So the net you're gaining. And I think that is, that's possible, but you see kind of how this is the case that, for most markets, you want to have transparency in prices. You see a lot of the CMS with hospital prices trying to have more transparency. And certainly if rebates are a relatively small percentage of the cost, then that doesn't make a huge difference. But if, as they're growing over time, you're having this challenge. So I think that's one area where you would think, okay, well, payers want lower costs and pharmaceutical companies prefer higher costs, but you kind of have this intermediary where, the PBMs prefer higher list prices with larger rebates, and that certainly makes the system much more complicated to examine.
Let's pivot now into the field of data, evidence, and regulation. With the growing regulatory scrutiny over real-world evidence and digital health tools as well, what does your gut say? Is this increased oversight ultimately enabling, or could it be stifling innovation?
Yes, I think the goal of real-world evidence is somewhat twofold. Is that the evidence can obviously be more reflective of a real environment versus in the clinical trial, and also you can get the real-world evidence typically much faster than you could in a clinical trial. That leads more drugs coming to market faster. So if you think about what are we trying to do, we're kind of balancing the type 1 and type 2 errors. So the type 1 errors is what if we approve a drug that doesn't work? That's kind of the concern. If we would use real-world data, if it's less reliable than randomized controlled trials, that's a problem. But I think fewer people worry about the type 2 error. That's like, what if there's kind of beneficial drugs that we don't approve, or there's delays in approval? I did a study looking at adoption of new treatments for atrial fibrillation, and you saw that geographic areas with slower uptake had higher rates of stroke. And so certainly in kind of the delays in getting treatment, those kind of costs are often not there. So I think the real world evidence can help provide some additional speed and kind of real world effectiveness information. I think that there is some challenges of obviously the reliability. The real world evidence requires a bit more discretion on the kind of researcher's part to what data should you use, what variables defined. Obviously for RCTs, you're defining that prospectively. And so there's kind of, less, it's just more kind of, I would say, straightforward versus the real evidence. The evidence often has been collected already, and you have to trade off how you're doing that. So I think it can be highly beneficial, but understanding that there are limitations for the real data.
So let's focus now on, particularly with your policy work with CMS and up to current. What can you think of one policy or regulation that you believe was well-intentioned, but it actually resulted in poor health or economic outcomes?
Sure. I think one kind of general theme, I don't know if it resulted in worse health, but maybe not better, was the value-based payment for providers. I think there was a big with the Affordable Care Act that we wanted to pay more for high quality providers that are lower costs and pay less for lower quality providers. And if you think about any normal market, if I buy a super fancy car, I'll pay more for that. But if I have a less fancy car, I pay, less for that. I'm paying based on quality. For doctors, especially for Medicare, you have the same basically reimbursement for any procedure or visit that you do, regardless of how good the doctor is. So it makes perfect sense that we should be rewarding high quality doctors and not rewarding low quality doctors. I think the challenge is just kind of the feasibility of doing that. Typically, you have13 outcome measures. A lot of them are process measures. You have to do risk adjustment, because if you have a lot of really seriously ill patients, that may not work. Sometimes you have like these leading academic medical centers that have really low quality scores, not because they do bad quality care, but they just get kind of the sickest, weirdest, rarest versions of the disease. And then it looks like they have really bad outcomes, but really they're taking the hardest patients. I think there's a lot of burden on the physicians. And then also, you may be focused on the quality measures that are being collected, but not on kind of quality measures that are not directly collected. So I think it's a great thing to do in theory, but in practice has been kind of burdensome. And I think a lot of the studies of kind of the CMS implementation, it hasn't saved much money. There is very little change in quality for the observed. So I think this was something that philosophically makes a lot of sense. Let's pay more for good quality, pay less for bad quality. But in practice, that hasn't really borne out to made a big difference in cost or quality and just been a big burden for the providers.
And it's not yielded the intention, because not because the idea itself isn't good. It's because you say that the burden is there, is too high, the tools are not sufficient. But you would advocate if there were better quality tools that were less burdensome.
Exactly, because if you have, we're looking at outcomes with patients with disease X. Like if a physician sees 3 patients, okay, well, how good a doctor are they? That's not a huge sample. If you have a huge sample, even so, what information can the payers get, right? So, okay, did they get hospitalized? Did they go to the ER? Okay, that's great. We can evaluate that quality. But what if someone has back pain? The doctor says, oh, I did a great job. They feel better. They can walk better. That's great. Well, the payer doesn't really see that quality unless they like do a survey or something like that. So they're just kind of getting the extreme outcomes that are coming in. So there's a big information gap. It's not, if I had I think you mentioned digital, if I had like a digital monitor and I could see, oh, their mobility improved and the payers could capture all of that, that it could be, but you just have a big gap between the physicians and what quality is and the patients and what they know what quality is, and then what the payers can observe. And so because you're only recording and evaluating people on a very narrow subset of quality, that's kind of the biggest issue. And you can say, oh, well, let's expand the amount of quality we're covering, but again, that's more burdensome. Are we putting trackers on people for mobility and surveying people on what they thought, and it ends up being pretty burdensome as you improve the quality measurement.
Still in the policy area, let me wade into some very current events. On July 31st, Trump sent a letter to the 17 pharmaceutical companies requesting commitments to provide U.S. patients with the same drug pricing for prescription drugs as in other developing nations. And this referenced back in May 2025 the executive order that said it was an intent to reduce those price disparities. Is something like this going to work? What comes to your mind as a health economist and someone deeply engaged in health policy?
Yeah, I think we kind of talked about it earlier. What is the goal of drug policy? And it's really to how do we incentivize the development of new medical technologies, but make sure it's set at a price that's reasonable. And certainly, the U.S. is bearing a large share of the cost, but I think, as I mentioned, most drugs fail. 90% of drugs that start human trials fail. Even if the drugs are successful, a lot of them don't make payback kind of the full R&D costs plus all the failed drugs. So it's really kind of like a blockbuster model, which is it's as a feature of the system. I think people view that as a bug of the system, but really that's, by having a few blockbusters that kind of finances all these drug development. And I think focusing again just on the short-term prices is very tempting, but how do we set up the system so that we're incentivizing innovation, but at a reasonable price? And I think if we're just saying like, well, let's reduce costs, that's not necessarily ideal. Certainly if you look at kind of the drug spending relative to GDP per capita, the US is much higher, and you would think, okay, well, it would be, reasonable if the US prices came down a bit and European prices came up. That could kind of balance things out, but will that happen? That's kind of to be determined.
What should our industry be doing and saying publicly about this? I know we're saying and doing a lot internally. But what should we be out? Who should we be talking to, and what should we be saying about this?
I mean, I think just for me, and again, I'm not a politician or anything like that, but I think, focusing on the goal of drug pricing, hey, we want to set the prices so that this incentivizes innovation, I think, and also at a reasonable price, and defining reasonable based on value, I think is key. I think also thinking about kind of the drug pricing dynamics, although, again, drugs are monopolies in terms of that specific molecule, new products enter the market, prices could come down, typically not get less the list price, but more kind of the rebates. And then obviously a lot of the drugs will go generic and be super cheap. If you think about heart failure, I mean, I think recommended treatment now is like 4 different drugs, which, like, wow, quadruple therapy, that's like so expensive. Who could afford it? Well, those are all generic now, basically. And it's super cheap to treat heart failure. There's, some new products that are coming on board, but, who could imagine a four treatment combination therapy, but, they're ACE inhibitors and things like that are all generic. So I think thinking about the long term, hey, that's, these are, X number of years from now will be very low cost. I think it is very difficult, to be honest, to think about those the longer term, but it may be helpful to kind of look back in retrospect to things like heart failure, where now we do have quadruple combination therapy that costs pennies, and that's really a huge success, and we're able to do that because we kind of incentivized through the patent system and through the current drug development system.
So I want to pivot now into doing a little bit of a look back and some of your personal perspectives. What's a belief that you held early in your career that you since outgrown or maybe radically changed your mind about?
I think going back, I certainly think kind of the value-based payment for providers. Again, I think that's a great idea in theory, but again, because the information on quality that the payers have relative to patients and doctors is so different, there may be things like readmissions that are fine to do that are pretty obvious, but for an individual patient, a lot of the measures are process measures. They don't really reflect the outcomes. I don't know they're going to save a bunch of money or improved a lot of quality. So I think, again, in theory, why wouldn't you pay more for good quality? Why wouldn't you pay less for bad quality? But just because the quality definition that most payers have is so poor, it ends up not working. And again, you could be in the future, hey, we're going to have digital monitors, or we're going to monitor all these things and have that kind of gap is going to shrink, and it could be useful in the future. But as currently constructed, I think those have not borne out as much as I would hope. And certainly in grad school early in my career, hey, why wouldn't you pay more for good quality? This is a slam dunk. And just in practice, it hasn't really worked out that.
Good learning. What keeps you up at night professionally?
Yeah, I think probably a couple things. One, I kind of mentioned, long-term thinking versus short-term thinking. It's certainly, we talked about innovation, that it's easiest to just focus on the short term and not think about the long term. And then I think also certainly, thinking about, kind of government pricing and the kind of challenges inherent in that. I think if you think about, okay, why don't we just have government set all drug prices, or not allow for flexibility in negotiations? I think that certainly ends up being problematic to be, and that can be true for provider pricing and for drug pricing. The challenge is certainly that could work pretty well if you think about kind of cost effectiveness analysis. Hey, drug comes out, let's measure the value. Hey, here we go. Okay, that could be good. But okay, what if new real world data comes out? It works better than we thought, less well than we thought. How do we adjust that? Oh, there's new competitors. Those things will change. If you think about on the provider system, there's like, cataract surgery back in the day was relatively expensive. It was a new technique. And then the technology got much better. It became very standard, but it took a long time for the relative prices to come down because you don't have kind of a competitive bidding system. And so I think because the first glance, things work pretty well if you have some government pricing, that's fine. If you think about, medical devices, hey, I have a medical device and then I have with a specific CPT code, great. Okay, now I have one that's 5% better. Oh, do I do a new code? Is it priced the same? It ends up being very difficult. So I think what keeps me up at night is those kind of administrative pricing. They don't work horribly, like in the short run. Like you're managing them pretty well. So like, oh, great. Why don't we just do that? But that only works if nothing changes in the world. And from my experiences, lots of things change. And so not incorporating those dynamics and allowing for some feedback is a big challenge. I think if you think about, a Medicare for all, that would be all government run. Right now, there's a commercial kind of insurance sectors. Hey, what are the prices we should use? Well, let's look at commercial. What are they paying? How's that work? If you did 100%, well, you don't have any of those kind of market-based prices. Like, okay, you just have to make it up. And again, those would work pretty well right away, but then those disappear. So I think that certainly keeps me up at night that when you're just thinking about how do we get things to work right now, but not realize that the world's going to change, there's going to be dynamics, and how do we incorporate mechanisms for that feedback that are much more rapid is something to keep up at night.
So, given that background and the things that you wonder about, how are we doing on training our PhD health economics students to be game changers in this world? Are we doing the right kind of education? What are we missing?
I mean, I think health economics is really interesting field, and I think part of it is, we really need to, it's an interdisciplinary field, right? We want to have health economists to have a set of skills, and I think how do we train them to have that set of skills, but then branch out? I mean, you can't really do a good analysis of medical technology without talking to doctors about, well, what's the current treatments, or how am I capturing the disease well? What are the outcomes I should be measuring? Once you tell me, I can do all those things. And then, talking to policymakers, hey, here I modeled this. Well, that's not how things actually work. This is how things are. So I think with I don't know that it's an issue with grad school. Like in grad school, you need to have kind of the health economics set of skills, and that's what it's there for. But I think bridging people either kind of during the health economics kind of program or, immediately after. So you're connecting with people outside your skill set, because for me, that's been, really important. I'd love to say I know everything about everything, but that's certainly not the case. And with, say with macro economists, you're going to be talking mostly with other macro economists, and that's great. With health economics, if you're just talking to other health economists and that's it, you're probably not doing a great job. You need to be talking to a lot of other people because it's so interdisciplinary. So how do we make that clear and have more opportunities? I know for my my PhD, I had people on my dissertation committee. One person was an operations research person for healthcare, and another person was a political science that kind of worked a lot on policy. And so having those different people was really helpful to me. And I think continuing to teach the skills in grad school, but then trying to make the connections and early in people's career is going to be highly beneficial, so that not, their expertise can be broader. You can bring in better people, and then also you can communicate to different people. Because sure, if you're only able to communicate to health economists, that's fine. But to make any major change, you need to be able to communicate to policymakers, to payers, to providers, to patient groups. And if you're not able to do that, that's highly problematic.
It's so consistent how people answer that question.
That's interesting.
I really hope our universities listen up. Tell me, this can be out of your professional field or within it, but what's one book that has shaped the way you think?
I'll say kind of two. One, Getting Things Done by David Allen certainly is helpful just for getting things done, has been very, very helpful on a practical level. And then one book I really enjoyed, the Power Broker, this is Robert Caro about Robert Moses. I think that was extremely interesting. I think people often view the government as a singular entity. What does the government do? What, et cetera. And this was a story about kind of bureaucratic person in New York who really remade New York City and had a lot of power, and how do things get done. So I don't know that's affects my day-to-day life, but just thinking about how things get done and how, kind of government actually works, that happens to be on the city level, I think was extremely interesting, and it's just an amazing book overall. So.
Great suggestion. What's the best conference you've ever attended, and why?
I'll give two conferences. I mean, I like ISPOR. That's kind of my type of people, and the topics are great. So I like ISPOR. I think the best conference in terms of the conference logistics, I went to the Informs conference, which is about operations research. I had a paper about, I think it was about can pharmacists give the flu shot, which now is obviously pretty trivial, but back in the day when they extended the flu shot to people aged 0 to, I think, 18, that was a huge number of people. And so we did a study on that. And that conference, every conference had like a code that was like the day, the room, the time. Every session started exactly on time and never ended 1 second late. All the meals were exactly where you think they would be and right on time. So if you thought the operations research conference would be extremely logistically well done, you are correct. It was immaculate. So that was in terms of, I think the conference itself and learning, it was interesting, but I think the conference logistics were pretty impressive.
Right person for that job.
There you go.
If you weren't a health economist, what would you be?
I would probably say NBA basketball player, but I don't think any of the teams would like that. But if it was up to me, that's fine. I've been doing a lot of running lately, so maybe I do that. So if it's purely up to me, that's what I would do. I don't know that I would be very successful in those, but those would be fun.
Very interesting. Well, some of the answers are librarian, salsa dancer, and my personal one would be to lead an outdoor survivalist group for kids.
Ooh, I that sounds fun, but if the kids, I don't know, the kids would survive with me in charge, so I'm not a good one for me.
What's something about you that would surprise your colleagues?
You may be surprised to hear that my two daughters don't think that any of my dad jokes are funny. So,
Well, give it 30 years and they'll think you're hilarious.
Maybe.
Maybe. We can always hope.
We can hope.
It's an imperfect market, those kids and parents.
Yeah. I tell them I'm always right, but for some reason they don't listen. So.
Well, the incentives are misaligned, so maybe you just need to sit down and have a conversation. See what you need to, how you need to incentivize them to laugh at you.
I think that sounds about right.
Or laugh with you.
There we go.
Well, listen, Jason, it's been a real pleasure, and I want to thank you so much for sitting down with Patti's People and the evidence base.
Yeah, thanks, Patti. Really appreciate it.
All right. Have a great rest of your day.